What's new? Why are supply chains breaking down? Kind of what's new about the supply chain that makes it different than any other period in the history of the world? And what's new were two things, and they arose around 1989. The first was you had a combination of increased computing power, algorithms, artificial intelligence, better data collections, new models. So you suddenly had the computational telecommunications and data to be a lot more sophisticated about how you handle the supply chain. But the second thing that happened at the same time was 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1991, the collapse, the demise of the former Soviet Union, which gave rise to new trading partners in both in Eastern Europe, where they were no longer behind the Iron Curtain, Poland and Romania and Hungary and many other countries. And at the same time, you had the rise of China. Now, technically, Mao Zedong died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping really started economic reform in 1978. China did have a fairly high growth period in the 1980s, but nothing like we see today. And it all came crashing down in 1989 with the Tiananmen Square massacre. And that really shut down U.S.-China relations, not fully, but there was no Western investment coming into China. It was kind of, they were persona non grata. The two countries were distant. And there was George H.W. Bush was president at the time, and there was just a cold spell between U.S. and China. Again, that's actually when I was there in China. I traveled quite a bit there in 1991, 92, and Wuhan, Chongqing, and Xi'an, and elsewhere. As I said before, you couldn't find an American. Well, that ended around 1992. Deng Xiaoping did what he called the Southern Tour, where he reaffirmed China's commitment to capitalist principles. They weren't overthrowing communism, but they were embracing capitalist market ideas. There was a thaw in U.S. relations, and then it was like no holds barred. Then that's when the U.S. investment really did pour in. So all in a short period between 1989 and 1992, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, new republics, China kind of re-enters the game. This was globalization. I'd been doing international economics, international finance. I worked at Citibank, at that time in the 80s. So we had international relations, international banking, et cetera, but it wasn't globalization. Russia had to enter the game. China had to enter the game. The Iron Curtain had to come down. All these things had to happen, and they did. So now all of a sudden you had the science I described, computing and artificial intelligence and applied math, and a true global market. So now the supply chains could go 9,000 miles from Chongqing to New York, or from Shanghai to Seattle, or London to Hong Kong, of course. So this was true globalization, much larger scale, much longer supply chains, and it worked. And so this was a period I call supply chain 1.0, 30-year period from 1989 to 2019. Now, why did it break down around 2019? I talked to one individual in particular who was probably the single individual most responsible for building the modern supply chain. And he told me it took us 30 years to build this. We blew it up in about 3 years. It's not going to come back overnight. It's going to take 5 or 10 years, or maybe longer, to rebuild in some form. And I think that's exactly right. So to your point, what was it, around 2019 that did cause it to break down? Well, a lot of people look at the pandemic and they go, oh yeah, COVID, that disrupted everything. That was the problem. And some people look at the war in Ukraine and the Russian sanctions and go, that was the problem. And they both made it worse, no doubt about it, made the supply chain worse. But it really started in 2018 with Trump's tariffs on China. Trump put tariffs on appliances and solar panels. Now, technically they were global, but most of that stuff was coming from China. So this was really a shot aimed directly at China. So China said, well, what can we do to strike back? Well, at the time, China was and is the world's largest importer of soybeans. They need the protein. They don't have enough. The U.S. and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. Well, China was buying all their soybeans from the United States because they were trying to reduce the trade deficit. We were buying so much stuff from them, and China said, well, what can we buy from the U.S. just to kind of balance the books a little bit? And the answer was soybeans. Well, when Trump put the tariffs on, China redirected all their soybean orders to Brazil. They stopped buying U.S. soybeans. Now, what are the U.S. farmers doing? Well, they were like, hey, we're still growing the soybeans. We can't sell them to China. Well, it turns out the Netherlands needed them. So, okay, we'll sell them to the Netherlands and distribute them to Europe. which they did. But once again, instead of Port of Los Angeles, you're using Port of Houston or Port of, Port Elizabeth near New York or whatever. And then this went on and on because Trump put more tariffs on to retaliate. China took more actions against the United States, canceled purchase. And it escalated from there. And by the way, there's very good data on this. It's not just a theory. I found some research, which I mentioned in my book and give the source for that. But it's a book by Lorianne LaRocco, who's a maritime cargo expert. And what's interesting about what she did, this data is available. We know where the vessels go. We know what's in them. We know when they leave and when they arrive. They all have GPS connections and people keep track. So you can look at all this data. She tracked what I just described. But here's what's interesting. She finished her book around December 2019. So it's like a controlled experiment in terms of pandemic, because if you'd written the book later, you'd see the disruption, but you'd have a very difficult time. Well, how much of that was tariffs and how much of that was COVID? When you have two things going on at once, it's very hard to separate the impact. But she has no COVID in her research because it was pre-COVID. The book was done before COVID outbreak occurred. So it's a pure case study of the impact of the tariffs. You can see the breakdown in 2018, 2019. Now, again, COVID made it worse. The war in Ukraine made it worse. But it's very clear that that's where it started. So that's why I use 2019 as just kind of an arbitrary date with a 30-year period of supply chain 1.0. Now getting to supply chain 2.0, but we're not there yet. The new supply chain will be what I call a college of nations, meaning there will still be outsourcing, there will still be trading partners, but it'll be like a club. They'll be friends. So they'll be kind of liberal, democratic, advanced economies. So it'll be, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, EU, UK, and some other countries. I expect India will be part of it. Brazil will be part of it. And they'll form their own trading blocks. And what that means is China is not going to be in the club. China is, atheistic, communistic, genocidal, abusive of human rights. I could go on and on, but, you take the point. They're going to have to put their own block together. And so you'll end up with a multi-block world. Maybe some countries like Brazil will trade with China and the US, but really the advanced developed economies, the democratic societies, and even developing economies that happen to be democratic, such as India, will be in this one club, and they'll trust each other, but they won't trust China. There'll be some added costs, but it'll be worth it because we'll avoid the hidden costs. The supply chain revolution has been driven by efficiency, meaning lower costs, which means higher margins for producers and lower costs for consumers. It seems like a win-win. But there were a lot of hidden costs, including fragility, susceptibility to breakdown, toleration of human rights abuses, child labor in the Congo, and on and on and on, that were never taken into account. And that's the stuff that will start to disappear when you have a club of nations.